Today, I'm going to be talking about 10 books which intimidate me, books which I think will challenge me, but books which I also think will be rewarding in the long run and worth the extra effort to read. They're definitely an effort to hold up, so I'm going to put them down now if that's okay with you. I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable in this video, I think, and admit that sometimes I do wish I had a better education growing up. In the part of England that I grew up in, formal education is not exactly celebrated. A far more important life skill would be how quickly can you down a pint? And although that is unquestionably a very important life skill, I do wish that I was introduced to reading certain literature at an earlier age. Whenever I've tried to extend myself in the past, I think it's very rare that I've left the experience wishing that I had never tried. It's almost always the case that I feel as though I've grown in a way, or that my tastes have developed thanks to this new exposure. I saw a video recently by the channel To Readers It May Concern, and the title was 10 hard books that I want to read, but it's fine if you don't. And so today I'm going to be jumping on the bandwagon and making my own little variation of this video. I'll say this as well, just quickly before I get started, is that some of the books that I'm going to talk about might not be as challenging as some of the books that I've seen others discuss when talking about this topic, but you know, it's not a competitive thing, right? Reading isn't really a competitive sport. Some books I might find challenging and you might not, but that's okay because we're all on our own reading journey. Anyway, let's just get on with it with my first book, and why not start with some Russian literature? You know, why not? The first book is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I've heard so much about The Brothers Karamazov, and I really hope I'm pronouncing it right, otherwise that's embarrassing. It's about three brothers and their relationship with each other, also the relationship with their father, and they all have different beliefs and different personalities. As I understand it, the story kind of explores their moral dilemmas, their faith, their family dynamics, and I think there's also a murder mystery involved as well. The reason that I want to read this is because, as I've mentioned before, the most important thing to me when it comes to fiction are characters. I think Dostoevsky really explores their internal lives, their philosophical questions that they ask of one another, and each of the brothers represent different aspects of belief and skepticism and morality. Even though it's the depth that I'm looking forward to in this book, I also know that that's going to be part of the challenge. Another aspect that I think is going to be quite challenging is the Russian names. I might not be familiar with a lot of the names that are popping up, and also the frequent allusions to 19th century Russian culture, which again, I might not be familiar with. Perhaps I will be after I've read the book. That's the idea, right? The next book that I'd love to read this year, I think it's going to take some doing. I might need to dedicate a full month to it, is Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. This book is categorized as an encyclopedic novel. It's set in a future North America, and the story revolves around a halfway house for recovering addicts and also a tennis academy. It's also about a movie that is just so entertaining that people, after they've watched it, lose the will to do anything else. I've seen this book on so many must-read lists, books you must read before you die, but I've also seen it on lists of books I couldn't finish. So we'll have to see if I'm up to the task, hopefully. First of all, it's absolutely massive, right? I don't think it's going to be the longest book I've ever read, but it will definitely be top 10. I think it's also filled with footnotes that you need to refer to, and so I'm sure when I read it I'll need to be flipping back and forth for context. But yeah, I think it's just one of those books that I'm really going to have to take my time with. It's not something that I'm going to be able to read in a few sittings. Sorry about that noise, by the way. That's my French bulldog snoring. Can you hear that? I think of all the books on my list, this one might be the most famously daunting, and I'm interested to see if I'm up to the challenge. I am a little bit nervous nervous, obviously, because I think this is going to be a really unique read, maybe something unlike anything I've read before. And of course, I'm nervous that I'm going to get 10% into the book and quit. If that happens, it happens, but I think it's worth the attempt anyway. A lot of my life is dedicated to reading, and this is just one of those famous books that people try to conquer. We'll see. Anyway, speaking of my snoring dog in the background, sorry, by the way, if you can hear him rumbling back there. The next book that I'd like to read is Paradise Lost by John Milton. Milton is the name of my little French bulldog in the corner making all the noise. My other French bulldog is called Poe, and he's named after Edgar Allan Poe, because I'm pretentious. Paradise Lost is an epic poem retelling the events in the Bible, including Satan's rebellion and Genesis and the temptation of Adam and Eve. I've heard that because of the lyrical nature of the text, it's a poem, right? It helps if you read it out loud. And so if nothing else, I get to annoy my wife by reading out loud some John Milton. And, as I say, just enjoy being pretentious. It's my passion. Next difficult book that I'd like to read is Père Goriot, or as my edition says, Old Man Goriot by Honoré de Balzac. This is a novel which is set in Paris immediately after the French Revolution, and it focuses on the dark side of money and society, social climbing and greed. I believe it's set in a run-down boarding house, and we follow two main characters. Eugene de Rastignac, I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. He's a young man, an ambitious man, but also very poor. Then we've got Père Goriot, who is his father that just is willing to give up everything for his kids. I think this story kind of digs into the middle classes immediately after the French Revolution, and the tough life that they lived, the growing gap between the rich and poor, and how people struggled in a society which is obsessed with wealth and status. And I'm looking forward to reading this because I want to see how much of this is reflected maybe in the society that we live in today. Next up is Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. I spoke recently on my channel about how I felt as though I was a bad Englishman because I'd never read this book before, and I want to rectify that. The Canterbury Tales is basically a collection of short stories that are rolled up into one big story told by a mixed group of characters from various backgrounds. I think you've got like a clergyman, you've got a noble, regular working class people all heading together on a pilgrimage to St. Becket's Shrine, I think it is. I think what interests me most about this book is how a collection of short stories has the ability to serve as part of a larger unifying story. And again, I think there's a lot to do with class here and how different classes back in these days are represented. Maybe just like the last book, recognizing any similarities and also contrasts that might still exist in today's society. I'm told that the language can be quite complicated because it's written in Middle English, and so I think that's going to be really challenging for me. But once again, I think that reading it aloud can help. By the way, you probably noticed that a lot of these are Penguin classics. I've got a little bit of a thing for Penguin classics, I'm a little bit of a collector. You might be able to see in the bookshelf on the top row there behind me, I've got a shelf dedicated to Penguin classics. There's a little gap in the middle where these ones are missing. So yeah, I just like the look of them. The next difficult book that I can't wait to read is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. This book sounds like no book that I've ever heard of. I don't think it's just the story that's unconventional, but also the formatting is famously complicated, where, as you read it, you have to turn the book sideways and upside down to be able to comprehend the text. I think there's musical notes that are in here as well. Some of it's written in Braille. This book is what's known as ergodic literature. And that basically means it's labor intensive, where you can't just sit back and enjoy the book as it's written. You actually have to put some physical effort into being able to comprehend what's in the book. So I think that there's a lot of footnotes where you have to turn back to the indices and to be able to understand the narrative as a complete text. I'm told that there are various ways to read this book. I think I'm just going to stick to front to back and then referring to the footnotes as I go. But yeah, this book is going to be a challenge, I know. And so for that reason, I've actually taken off a few days from work. That's going to be later on in the month. And maybe by the time that this video comes out, I would have already read this book, and maybe a review might even be out of this book, because yes, in a couple of days I'm going to tackle this one. I've taken off 3 days. So some people say that this book takes a month to read. Some people say it takes a couple of months, or they really had to take their time with it. But I'm going to be literally dedicating 10 hours a day to just getting through this book. And the reason that I'm doing it that way is because I want to feel completely immersed in this book. I'm also told that there's a soundtrack by a musical artist called Poe, who I think is Danielewski's sister, and it is intended to accompany the text in this book. So I'll be listening to the soundtrack. By the way, really unusual that a book has a soundtrack, right? But I'll be listening to the soundtrack. I'll be flipping through the pages. I might lose my mind. Apparently, this book is very scary. Some people say that after they've read the book, they could no longer have it in the house. They had to get it out of the house. I hope that that's the case with me, because I love the feeling of being terrified by a book. I really desperately want this to be terrifying. We'll see. The next book that I think will be difficult for me to read, but will probably be worth it, is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. I think Moby Dick is probably one of the most famous books ever written. It certainly has one of the most famous opening lines ever written, "Call me Ishmael." I know that line even though I've never read this book, and it's told from the perspective of a young sailor who refers to himself as Ishmael. As I understand it, this is a deep dive, excuse the pun, into themes of obsession and seeking revenge against the natural world. This, I think, really is the ultimate TBR challenge. I'm going to use another pun. Sorry for the second pun in a row. It is the white whale of serious readers, I think. I hear that this book has very long passages about the whaling industry, and that can sometimes test a reader's patience. I suspect that out of all of the books in this video, this is the one that will probably test me the most, because I do enjoy, when I'm reading something, I really enjoy the plot. And some people say that you have to give up the idea that every novel has to be about plot in order to enjoy this book. So I'm told that, there are moments that are going to test your patience as a reader of more kind of traditional linear narrative, but it's worth it. There are moments of brilliance in this book that make the more tedious moments worth it. And so it's worth a shot, baby. The next book on the list is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. One of my favorite books of all time is The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and I'm told that this book is nothing like that. Blood Meridian really intrigues me, but it also kind of scares me as well, because it's supposed to be one of the most violent books ever written. My cousin read this last year, and he told me that the violence in certain parts of this book becomes so overwhelming that you start to kind of feel numb to it in a way. And maybe that's the point. The prose in this book is supposed to be very sparse. The punctuation is unconventional, and the landscapes are very bleak. You never feel comfortable reading this book, apparently. It's supposed to be quite hard to keep track of what's happening in certain points as well. I think as the reader, I'm going to feel very confused. I might be spending some time kind of carefully looking things up online, trying to avoid any spoilers as I go. But yeah, I think I'm going to try and find a guide. There's a guy that does YouTube videos where he gives kind of instructions on how to approach certain books. I can't remember his name right now as I'm recording this video, but when I edit it, I'm going to put his name down here, the name of the channel. And I think, yeah, one of the books that he speaks about is Blood Meridian, and he has like a whole hour-long video on how to read Blood Meridian. So I'll probably watch that before I tackle this one. I plan on reading this book this year, at least. I'm going to read this book at some point this year, and I'll be releasing a review and everything like that. So if you're interested in seeing that, make sure to subscribe. I do think that this book is going to be difficult to get through, but that's the point, isn't it? That's the whole point of this video. It's about challenging myself and exposing myself to new literary experiences. And I think that this is certainly going to qualify as that. So the next book, which I think will be very challenging for me, is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Of all of the books that I'm talking about in this video, I feel as though the language in this book will be a little more accessible. I think it's the book as a whole is going to be easier to digest. The challenge will be more just the large cast of characters and the pure scope of the story. As you can see, this is another chunky boy. The Count of Monte Cristo is a tale of betrayal and revenge, and who doesn't like revenge? I mean, revenge is really delicious, isn't it? I've heard that whilst some of the books that I've mentioned earlier in the video might seem a little old-fashioned and foreign to a modern reader in terms of the prose that they use, this one is just like a real page-turner. It's just as thrilling today as when it was initially released. Apparently, not my opinion, the opinion of the reviews that I've seen online. And a lot of people say that this is the greatest revenge novel of all time. Maybe. We'll see. I kind of just want to read it now. I just sort of want to read it now. I'm going to read this one really soon, I think. Next book is A Little Life by Yanagihara. And I think this one's going to be a little bit different from the others, more contemporary, certainly, but also challenging in a different way, maybe. It's kind of famous as being one of the most heartbreaking books of all time. It's dealing with themes of trauma and friendship and the emotional weight that a shared connection can carry. I've been told that before I dive into this book that I need to emotionally prepare myself, because there are going to be sections of this book where it feels as though I'm wading through black tar. It sounds very ominous. The reason for that, I think, is because the characters are so well developed, so fully realized that you can't help but feel a connection to them. And so when they suffer hardships, you suffer along with them. Will I cry when I read this book? I mean, knowing me, I think that's a pretty safe bet. Yeah, I probably will. So there you have it, my top 10 hard books that I'd like to read, but you don't have to. I'd like to hear your thoughts about some of the books that I've picked. Do you think that they're going to be as challenging as I've estimated them to be? Are there any books that I should have included? Other books that might be challenging for me, and books that were challenging for you, but you felt as though they were worth it in the long run? Please let me know in the comments section below. The first book that I'm going to be reading and reviewing is going to be House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. And so if you'd like to see my review of that video, of that book rather, then you can click up here. Thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and happy reading.